This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update from Tyler Cozzens, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, begins today's show as he explains what reports have shown for the cattle and beef market. Keeping the show rolling is Mitch Ricketts, Professor of Agricultural Safety and Health at K-State, as he discusses what health issues dust could be creating for producers. He shares a few examples of cases where dust created concerns for people. Mitch Ricketts ends the show by continuing his conversation and providing a list of options for how people can protect themselves. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Tyler, what update do you have for us today when it comes to trade for livestock?
So this last week, we got trade data from USDA's Foreign Ag Service and Economic Research Service. They actually released data for the month of May, so we got one more month of data. So although the data is over a month old, it's official USDA data and statistics, so it does provide us valuable information, which I'd like to discuss. And the first thing I'd like to actually discuss is specifically U.S. livestock trade statistics. So kind of looking at the import side of things of livestock, kind of focusing on the cattle side here. From January through May, those first 5 months of the year, total cattle imports were just over 269,000 head, which was a decrease of 296,000 head, or more than 50%, or about a half of a decline from the amount of cattle that we saw imported during the same first 5 months of the year last year in 2025. The year-to-date decline in cattle imports, as you might expect, is due partly to lower imports from Canada, which were down more than 71,000 head, or about 20% from the same period last year. So kind of continuing this discussion on Canada imports from Canada, looking a little bit closer at cattle imports from Canada. In recent months, about 1/3 of cattle imports from Canada have been feeder cattle imports for placements into feedlots. Now, on a monthly basis, the imports of cattle from Canada have actually ranged from about 8,000 head to almost 14,000 head. And this is actually quite similar to what we saw last year as far as import levels from Canada, so not totally unexpected. A majority of these cattle, more than a half to almost 2/3 of the cattle that we import from Canada, are typically cattle that are for immediate slaughter, right? So those are kind of those market-ready cattle that we see that go into those slaughter facilities. So on average, the pace of slaughter-ready cattle from Canada has been tracking similar to a year ago levels for the last 12 months. So overall, the pace of cattle imports from Canada is tracking similar to a year ago. So not too big of a change or surprise there on that front. Now, looking at cattle imports from Mexico, as you would expect, the border's been closed between the U.S. and Mexico, and so that remains a primary factor leading to lower U.S. cattle imports through the first 5 months of this year. This is also entirely due to the border remaining closed to the U.S., as I had mentioned. This is due to the continued spread of New World screwworm in that part of the region of the U.S. and northern Mexico. Currently, based on latest USDA data from Animal and Plant and Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, they're reporting 34 total domestic cases of New World screwworm. On their website, they do note that 20 of those cases are active and 14 of those cases are inactive. Now, switching over to the cattle export side of things, U.S. cattle exports totaled 192,000 head through the first 5 months of the year. That's actually up almost 27,000 head, or about 16% from the same period last year. The increase is due almost entirely to larger cattle exports to Canada. From January through May, U.S. cattle exports to Canada totaled almost 187,000 head, which is an increase of about 28,000 head, or about 17% from the same period last year. Now, cattle exports to Canada are typically feeder cattle, and those are typically placed into feedlots that are located in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Interestingly, looking at cattle on feed data in Canada, those numbers actually started to track higher above a year ago, starting in March. Currently, Canada has just over 1 million head of cattle on feed. This is an increase of about 130,000 head, or about 15% from the same period last year. The increase in cattle exports is interesting in the fact that cattle prices are strong in Canada, which appears to be spurring a rebuild in Canada's cattle supplies, which have been trending slightly higher for the last 2 years. based on data that is reported from USDA's Foreign Ag Service. USDA is expecting Canada's cattle supplies to continue moving slightly higher for 2026, which is due to a larger breeding herd and Canada looking to actively fill available feedlot space to meet strong domestic demand in Canada. Now, looking at cattle exports to Mexico through May, they're actually down 790 head to a total of just over 4,600 head through those first 5 months of the year. And so kind of a last point here on cattle imports. Over the last decade, U.S. cattle imports have ranged from about 1.6 to 2.4 million head. This has accounted for about 5 to 8% of total commercial cattle slaughter in the U.S. each year. So lower cattle imports may not have a large impact on aggregate in cattle slaughter in the U.S., but regionally, the lower cattle imports does impact available supplies in the Southern Plains, kind of primarily that Texas, Oklahoma, and Southwest Kansas area.
Tyler, and thinking about our market, what are we seeing for beef trade?
Yeah, so kind of switching gears and looking on the trade side of things, through the first 5 months of the year, total beef imports were almost 2.8 billion pounds. That's an increase of about 250 million pounds, or about 10% higher than the same period last year. So let's discuss a few of where these primary suppliers of beef to the U.S. market, where we're getting that from. So Brazil, through the first 5 months of the year, has been that leading supplier of beef to the U.S. market, accounting for 621 million pounds of beef imported into the U.S. Australia comes in at second at 560 million pounds. Brazil is actually down 7%, or about 45 million pounds from a year ago, but Australia is actually up about 12%, or 60 million pounds compared to a year ago. So if we kind of look at those two countries, Brazil and Australia, they're actually accounting for just over 40%, 43% in total of the beef imports to the U.S. Now, Canada comes in at third at 412 million pounds. That's actually up 4%, or about 16 million pounds. Mexico comes in at fourth at 327 million pounds. That's actually up 27%, or 70 million pounds, so an increase there. And then New Zealand comes in the fifth spot at 283 million pounds through the first 5 months of the year. And they're actually down 4%, or about 11 million pounds. But if we look at those top 5 countries, a majority, about two-thirds to almost three-quarters of the beef that we import come from those 5 countries: Brazil, Australia, Canada, Mexico, New Zealand. But overall, still seeing higher number of beef imports, and expected to see that continue to climb, which is not unexpected, as we import primarily lean beef trimmings to be ground with our fat trimmings to get the various ground beef products that are available in the grocery stores. So kind of on that note, a little bit of a side note on the ground beef market. In May, USDA reported the retail ground beef price at $6.75 per pound, which was an increase of 76 cents, or about 13% from the previous year, and the second highest on record behind April's record of $6.90 per pound. Ground beef prices here first went above the $6 mark in June last year, so about a year ago, and ground beef prices are likely to stay elevated in the $6 per pound range in the near term. The question of interest would be if ground beef prices can reach $7 per pound. And if so, then how quickly does the ground beef price get to $7 per pound? Realistically, the price is only 20 to 25 cents away from $7 per pound. So the rise in ground beef price is not unexpected, as weekly wholesale prices remain strong for both 90% and 50% lean trimmings, which are the prices to watch because these are used to make the various ground beef products found in the retail beef meat case, and therefore will be indicators into the retail ground beef price that consumers see at the grocery store. Last week, the wholesale price for 90% lean beef was $4.63 per pound, well above the $4.25 per pound level at the same time last year, and well above the 5-year average of $3 per pound. Last week's price for 50% lean beef trimmings were $1.80, which is similar to a year ago and holding steady. 50% lean beef price is much higher compared to the 5-year average, which is actually about $1.10 for that 5-year average. So seasonally, it's expected to see the 90s and 50% lean beef trimmings to climb through the first half of the year and peak during the summer months when demand for summer grilling is strongest. Prices for both 90s and 50% lean beef seasonally soften during the second half of the year, which could lead to ground beef prices remaining steady through the remainder of the year. Of course, this all depends on consumer demand for beef at the grocery store. So overall, it's not surprising to see ground beef price hold strong at record levels in the mid to upper $6 per pound range. Prices for ground beef will likely remain strong as prices for 90s and 50s are holding steadily strong through the summer months here and into the second half of the year. Of course, this is all dependent on consumer demand, which is signaling to be very strong and robust. Now, looking at beef exports, A slightly different discussion here when it comes to beef exports. Through the first 5 months of the year, total beef exports were actually 980 million pounds. This was a decrease of 200 million pounds, or about 17% down from the same period last year. Not completely unexpected, as the decline in cattle inventories continues to tighten this and just lower the available exportable supplies. As we would expect from an economic standpoint, as domestic cattle supplies tighten, that also translates into higher beef prices, which we're seeing. This is all with the assumption that beef demand remains strong domestically and globally. And so far, beef demand appears to be holding strong, which will likely be a headwind to beef exports here in the near term. So let's look a little bit closer here as far as beef exports through the first 5 months of the year. South Korea and Japan are those top two markets for us. We've seen just over 200 million pounds exported to both of those countries. That's actually down about 12 to 19% compared to a year ago. But we look at those two countries because they account for about half of the beef exports go to specifically to South Korea and Japan. So then next you have Mexico as the third top destination for beef exports, and they're actually down about 16% from a year ago to 110 million pounds. And then Canada is kind of that next country, coming in at number 4 with 86 million pounds exported through the first 5 months. That's down 11%. And as a quick side note on beef exports, the total amount of commercial beef production in the U.S., about 5 to 8% is destined for export markets. That 5 to 8% range of beef exports as a percent of commercial beef production has been in place for the better part of 3 decades. I bring this up because in 2025, the U.S. exported 3% of commercial beef production, and it has not been that low of a proportion since the late 1980s. So overall, beef exports are trending lower through the first 5 months of the year, and this trend will likely continue through the rest of this year as domestic cattle and beef supplies remain historically low.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing health concerns from dust with Professor of Agricultural and Safety and Health at K-State, Mitch Ricketts. Mitch, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Shelby. It's good to see you.
Mitch, as we're talking about dust in today's interview, what do we mean by dust?
Well, there are many different types of dust that we can run into in agriculture. Farming is just a very dusty business. We're exposed to dust when we're handling grain, caring for livestock, tilling, harvesting, handling stored products, and a lot of other activities. Agricultural dust has a lot of different components in it. Besides the soil and the plant material that we think about being in the dust, there's also mold, bacteria, dust mites, and a lot of other organisms. And when we breathe the dust that contains those organisms, it can cause allergic or toxic reactions.
And what are some of those different reactions that could be caused from this dust?
In most cases, fortunately, the effects are mild. The most common effects would be mild allergic reactions, things like a runny nose, itchy eyes, that sort of thing. But the reactions can also be more severe in certain cases, and sometimes they can even require medical attention. So if we were to consider some of the more severe effects of agricultural dusts, one that is extremely common, but a lot of people don't know about it, has a very complicated name, Organic Dust Toxic Syndrome, or ODTS. So since ODTS is a lot easier than Organic Dust Toxic Syndrome, I'll just refer to it as that. Again, this is very common. Researchers estimate that about 1 out of every 4 farmers experiences it at least once during their career, and many farmers experience it over and over again. And in this particular illness, the person experiences fever, chills, cough, muscle aches, very much like the flu. It typically happens within a few hours after a person has been in an enclosed area, maybe a grain bin or a hay barn, someplace like that, where there were very high concentrations of dust in the air. It typically lasts for just a few days. It usually happens when the agricultural products are moldy or out of condition. It's not an allergic reaction. This one is believed to be caused by toxins that are present in the bacteria and the fungi. And to help understand it a little bit better, I pulled out a case from a medical journal that kind of illustrates how this can develop. So in this particular case, a worker was unloading old grain from a storage structure. The grain was very dusty and it had a lot of mold. It was so dusty as he was unloading it that he had to stop very often because his eyes were burning and he was coughing. So that's a really common scenario of how this can happen. And here's what he experienced. So he got the work done, he got the bin unloaded, and a few hours after finishing for the day, he began to feel ill. And what he experienced was shortness of breath, muscle pains, sweating or perspiration, a high fever, and constant coughing. Well, he went to bed. The next day he got up, did not feel any better, still had all the same symptoms. So he went to the hospital. Doctors examined him and they found that he had fluid in his lungs. That's an indication that the lungs are inflamed. He was diagnosed with ODTS and kept at the hospital. But 2 days after he was exposed, he recovered fully. There were no permanent effects. He felt well, and before long they allowed him to go home. And that case is just really typical of the ODTS. It usually involves a massive exposure to organic dusts, typically that are moldy or may have a lot of bacteria in them. You get sick just a few hours after that exposure. The symptoms are kind of like the flu: fever, chills, headache, muscle aches, cough, that sort of thing. The lungs are inflamed, and the person usually recovers pretty quickly on their own. Now, in some cases, the symptoms may be more severe, or they may last longer. And the severe and the prolonged cases, they can require a doctor's care. One of the reasons we get concerned about ODTS is that the signs and symptoms are very similar to a much more serious condition called hypersensitivity pneumonitis, or HP. That one typically, there are two different forms of it. There's an acute form and a chronic form. The acute form typically happens, again, after a very massive exposure to a lot of dust containing organic material. And it has very similar symptoms to ODTS. It's a flu-like illness. That one is typically going to require medical care to recover from it. And in some cases, that can turn into a chronic illness where a person develops the chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis. And if that occurs, they become very sensitive to certain allergens. This condition is an overreaction of the body's immune system to allergens and to irritating substances. And people who develop the chronic form of hypersensitivity pneumonitis, it can have a profound impact on their life. In fact, many of them end up having to stop farming because it's so serious. But so we've got the mild illnesses like the allergic reaction, the itchy nose, the watery eyes. If we get massive exposures to dust, then we may have something more severe like the organic dust toxic syndrome. If we're exposed to it a lot, we might get hypersensitivity pneumonitis, which is a disabling condition. We also need to think about asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. If a person already has asthma, exposure to agricultural dust can trigger attacks. And a person who's never had asthma before can develop it if they're repeatedly exposed to agricultural dust. In most cases, asthma can be treated with medications such as an inhaler, but it can also become a life-threatening disease. And then chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, it usually lasts the rest of a person's life once they develop it. There are different forms. One type of COPD is chronic bronchitis. It's somewhat similar to asthma in that it is the small airways, the bronchi and the bronchioles in the lungs become inflamed. It becomes hard to breathe. There's wheezing, but it doesn't go away between episodes like asthma does. And then another form of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is emphysema. And with emphysema, the alveoli or the small air sacs within the lungs, they become damaged. Again, with COPD, people usually don't recover. It can be managed and their quality of life can be improved, but it cannot be cured.
What are some things then that farmers or ranchers or people working in agriculture can be doing to protect themselves?
Well, the first thing you can do to protect yourself is think about whether or not you smoke. All illnesses involving the lungs are more common and more severe among folks who smoke. So if you don't smoke, don't start. If you do smoke, visit with your doctor. See if you can get into a program where maybe if you're able to quit smoking, these types of reactions to dust may not be quite so common. Then also, if you know that you already have a serious lung disease, something like asthma, hypersensitivity, pneumonitis, COPD, something else, visit with your doctor before you do any work that's going to expose you to agricultural dust. Because sometimes people with these pre-existing conditions, they can have very severe reactions to the dust, and something you need to talk with your doctor about before you do that work again. If you've never had those symptoms and you do develop severe symptoms while you're around agricultural dust, be sure and visit with your doctor. It may be something, it may just be a very temporary condition, or it could be something more severe. Now, other things that you can do. Very often the person running the combine is exposed to a great deal of dust and may develop some of these illnesses. So think about whether or not the cab of your equipment has an air filtration system in it. If it does, keep that system maintained so that the air within the cab is as clean as possible. Some of the things to make sure that you change the air filters as needed. Also think about the gaskets on your doors and windows. Those things are there to help keep the dust out.
That was Professor of Agricultural Safety and Health at K-State, Mitch Ricketts. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Mitch as we continue our conversation, and he discusses some more options for helping keep producers and others safe around dust. If you aren't going to be able to hear the rest of today's conversation but would like to catch it, you can always find it on agtoday.net or by searching for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. We're now cutting to that short break. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our show with K-State's Mitch Ricketts as he continues discussing health safety concerns when it comes to dust for producers.
Try to stay out of bins and dusty areas, places where you could be exposed to massive amounts of dust. If you do go in to those areas, you may need to consider a respirator. And with respirators, again, it's good to visit with your doctor before you begin using it because it is much harder to breathe through a respirator than it is without one. And people with heart and lung conditions, they can endanger their health if they wear a respirator. It can cause increased stress on the heart. Wearing a respirator also increases the chance of heat-related illnesses. So if you are wearing a respirator, take plenty of rest breaks in cool areas if you can, drink plenty of water, and just be thinking about how you feel and whether you're experiencing something that might be a sign of a heat illness. Now, if you're in good health with no pre-existing conditions, an N95 dust mask is usually going to provide the protection that you need. These are fairly inexpensive. You can pick them up on the internet, at farm stores, at the big box lumber yards. With the N95s, a genuine N95 filter will be stamped on the front with the letters NIOSH or NIOSH, which stands for the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. It will also have some numbers on it that are approval numbers from NIOSH. So with that N95 respirator, you want to change it if it looks dirty or if it's hard to breathe through. Remember that type of respirator it's supposed to fit tight against your face. So if you're not clean shaven, it's not as effective. Remember that it does not supply oxygen, so you cannot go into, don't enter a well or a cistern or any other place where there might not be enough oxygen, and it's not going to filter out any hazardous gases or vapors. So an N95 respirator is the most basic respirator that we can use. It's just a filtering face piece. If we want to go a step above that, we can consider a respirator with a silicone face piece and a P100 filter. We used to call those HEPA filters. Now they're called P100 filters. And those provide a bit better protection than the N95 respirator. There are some drawbacks, however. The silicone face piece respirators are definitely less comfortable and they are more expensive. Just like with the N95s, you have to change the filtering material when it's dirty or hard to breathe through. Again, you're supposed to be clean shaven. They don't provide oxygen. With the silicone rubber face pieces, you can get filters to filter out limited amounts of certain gases and vapors, but still they're not going to be effective enough to go into areas where the air is really hazardous because of gases or vapors. Now, if a person does have a health condition that affects their lungs or their heart, after visiting with their doctor, they may consider, instead of using one of those first two respirators, they might consider using a powered air purifying respirator. This one also works with people who have beards. So that goes by the initials PAPR, powered air purifying respirator. And this respirator has an air pump and a filter, and so it pumps air through the filter into your face piece, or you could even have a hood instead of the face piece. So it pushes the air through the filter for you, makes it easier to breathe, and since you can get one that is a hood instead of a tight-fitting face piece, you can use it even if you have a beard. It's got similar limitations to the others. It does not provide oxygen. The filters have to be changed, and it's only got a limited potential for filtering hazardous gases and vapors. Now, for farmers who have employees, if your employees are going to wear respirators, then you're going to be required by federal regulations to have a complete respiratory protection program, which will involve things like physical exams, respirator cleaning schedule, and a variety of other things.
Mitch, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet, Shelby. It was great to visit with you.
That was K-State's Mitch Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.